Imagine two countries so close that an American president once stood beside Iran's king and called him an island of stability in one of the most unstable regions on Earth. Now imagine that same friendship decades later turned into missiles flying across the Persian Gulf. Real strikes, real casualties, a blockade choking one of the most important waterways on the planet. So, what happened? How do two nations go from allies to enemies dropping bombs on each other? Let's go back, way back, long before Iran was even called Iran, back when the world still knew it as Persia. For most of its early history, the US-Persia relationship was remarkably free of conflict. Unlike Britain and Russia, which spent the 1800s carving up Persia for its trade routes and resources, America had no colonial ambitions there. Persians often saw the US as the rare Western power without a hidden agenda. American missionaries built schools and hospitals. American advisors invited by Tehran helped modernize Iran's finances in the early 1900s. During World War II, when Britain and the Soviet Union occupied Iran to secure a supply line to Russia, the US arrived as a third, less intrusive party. In 1943, Franklin Roosevelt met Iranian leaders in Tehran and pledged support for the country's post-war independence. By the late 1940s, Washington and Tehran had no history of war, no colonial baggage, and a shared wariness of Soviet expansion. That would not last. In 1951, Iran's parliament nationalized its British-controlled oil industry, led by nationalist Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. Britain, humiliated, appealed to Washington. The Eisenhower administration, fearing Soviet inroads during the Cold War, agreed to help. In August 1953, the CIA and Britain's MI6 organized a covert operation, Operation Ajax, that removed Mossadegh from power. The U.S. formally acknowledged its role in documents declassified in 2013. The coup restored full power to Iran's monarch, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah, who would rule as a close U.S. ally for the next 26 years. For many Iranians, 1953 is still the moment the friendship curdled. Proof Washington would sacrifice Iranian democracy for its own interests. For a quarter century, Iran was one of America's closest Middle East partners. The Shah bought billions in U.S. weapons. American advisors trained his military and his secret police, SAVAK, feared for surveillance, arrest, and torture of dissidents. To Washington, the Shah was a bulwark against Soviet influence and a guarantor of oil supplies. To many Iranians, he was an unelected autocrat propped up by a foreign power, modernizing rapidly while repressing dissent. Opposition grew through the 1970s, uniting nationalists, leftists, and religious conservatives, including followers of an exiled cleric, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. By 1978, mass protests were shaking the country, and government crackdowns only deepened the anger, a pattern Iran's own leadership would repeat on a far larger scale decades later. In January 1979, the Shah fled. Khomeini returned from exile to a hero's welcome and was proclaimed leader of the Iranian Revolution. The monarchy was gone, replaced by the Islamic Republic, with Khomeini as supreme leader until his death in 1989, a man who famously called the United States the Great Satan. The breaking point came that October, when Washington allowed the exiled Shah in for cancer treatment. To young revolutionaries, it looked like a possible replay of 1953. On November 4, 1979, students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and seized its staff. 66 Americans taken hostage, 52 held for 444 days. The crisis ended January 20th, 1981, the day Ronald Reagan took office, under a U.S. brokered release deal. But the damage was permanent. The two countries severed diplomatic ties in 1980 and have never restored them. Switzerland still represents U.S. interests in Iran today. The 1979 revolution added a religious layer to this conflict that has never fully lifted. Khomeini didn't call America merely a rival power. He called it the Great Satan, a specifically religious epithet first used publicly in November 1979. The Islamic Republic's founding doctrine, Velayat-e-Faqih, held that only clerical Islamic governance was legitimate. That made opposition to Western secular influence in the eyes of Iran's leadership a matter of faith as much as policy, distinct from the Soviet Union, which Khomeini dismissed as merely a lesser Satan. Washington, for its part, rarely framed the dispute in religious terms. Its objections centered on hostages, weapons, and later, nuclear enrichment. That asymmetry has persisted for decades. State ceremonies in Iran still feature death to America chants, even as many ordinary Iranians, by various accounts, don't share that hostility toward the American people themselves. What followed wasn't open war, but nearly 4 decades of hostility playing out across the region. During the brutal Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, Washington tilted toward Saddam Hussein, even as intelligence showed his chemical weapons use. It was also during this war that Iran began the nuclear research program that would later dominate the relationship. In 1988, the U.S. Navy accidentally shot down an Iranian civilian airliner, killing 290 people. An event Iran has never forgotten, and the U.S. never formally apologized for, though it paid compensation. Iran built a regional network of allied militias across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, what it called the Axis of Resistance, and what Washington viewed as a direct security threat. Sanctions became America's main tool of pressure, crippling Iran's economy for a generation without removing its government. In 2013, for the first time since the hostage crisis, a U.S. and Iranian president spoke directly. That thaw produced the 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, in which Iran agreed to dismantle a reactor, sharply limit enrichment, and accept monitoring in exchange for sanctions relief. Experts widely believed it delayed any Iranian path to a bomb by at least a decade. It was controversial from the start. Critics in Congress and Israel's government argued it ignored Iran's missile program and its regional militias. In 2018, President Donald Trump withdrew the U.S. from the deal and reimposed sanctions. Iran didn't abandon it immediately, but by 2019, with promised relief never arriving, it began exceeding the enrichment limits. The nuclear question was back at the center of the relationship, more dangerous than before. In 2019, Washington designated Iran's Revolutionary Guard a terrorist organization. In January 2020, a U.S. drone strike killed Qasem Soleimani, Iran's most powerful military commander, at Baghdad's airport. Iran retaliated with a missile strike on U.S. forces in Iraq. For years after, the two countries fought largely through proxies, cyber attacks, sabotage, militia strikes, rather than direct confrontation. That changed after the October 2023 Hamas attack on Israel and the Gaza war that followed. As Israel dismantled much of Hamas and severely weakened Hezbollah, Iran's most powerful ally, Iran's regional network was left weaker and more exposed than at any point in decades. The stage was set for something larger. By 2025, new nuclear talks were underway. Then on June 12th, hours after Trump publicly reaffirmed his commitment to diplomacy, Israel launched a surprise attack on Iran, striking nuclear facilities and killing senior commanders and scientists. Iran retaliated with missiles and drones. 12 days later, after the U.S. joined with bunker-buster strikes on Iran's fortified nuclear sites at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, a ceasefire was reached. The 12-day war badly damaged Iran's nuclear infrastructure and leadership, but didn't resolve the dispute. It also hollowed out Iran's regional deterrence and deepened an economic crisis already pushing the country toward the breaking point. That breaking point arrived within months. On December 28, 2025, protests erupted nationwide over economic collapse and years of accumulated anger. The government's response was severe. By early January, security forces launched a violent crackdown. Iran's own supreme leader acknowledged thousands killed. Independent monitors, including Human Rights Watch, documented estimates running into the tens of thousands, among the deadliest crackdowns in the Islamic Republic's history. Iran's government disputed the higher figures, and in February, President Masoud Pezeshkian publicly apologized to the nation. President Trump encouraged the protesters and warned Tehran against continuing. Iran entered 2026 economically shattered, politically fractured, and militarily weaker than it had been in a generation. With talks deadlocked over Tehran's refusal to end all enrichment, the U.S. and Israel launched a coordinated assault on February 28, 2026. In under 12 hours, nearly 900 strikes hit missile sites, air defenses, and leadership. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed, along with dozens of senior officials. Trump called it the single greatest chance for Iranians to reclaim their country. The strikes also killed civilians, including, by some reporting, roughly 170 people at a girls' school near a naval base. Iran responded within hours, hundreds of missiles and thousands of drones at Israel, U.S. bases, and Gulf allies, and moved to shut the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most vital oil corridors, triggering global fuel shortages. The war Washington and Tehran had circled for nearly half a century had finally, openly arrived. What followed was long and grinding, marked by repeated ceasefires and repeated collapse. In April, after 5 weeks of fighting, a Pakistan-mediated truce lasted barely a day before disputes over the Strait of Hormuz unraveled it. The U.S. answered with a full naval blockade. In June, a more detailed 14-point agreement reopened the strait and set a 60-day negotiating window. It held just over a week before a tanker strike reignited hostilities. By late July, strikes were hitting Iran nightly again. Dozens killed and hundreds injured in a single week, and U.S. service members killed as well. Both sides now consider that June agreement effectively dead. One question: who controls and verifies shipping through the Strait of Hormuz has repeatedly proven capable of collapsing every attempt at peace. As of this recording, the war remains active and unresolved. Diplomatic contact continues alongside the fighting. Trump says talks are ongoing even as strikes continue, but no lasting settlement has held. What's clear is the scale of what's already been lost. Tens of thousands of Iranian civilians dead from the government's own crackdown, thousands more killed in direct war, a regional economy strained by blockade, and a fractured Iranian leadership still finding its footing after the killing of a man who led the country for 37 years. The story of the United States and Iran began over a century ago as an unlikely friendship between two countries with little reason to distrust each other. It became a story of a coup, a revolution, a hostage crisis, decades of shadow conflict, a broken nuclear deal, and finally, in 2026, open war. Whether this is the final chapter or simply the next one is a question that, as of today, no one in Washington or in Tehran can yet answer. History doesn't end with one event. There's always more to the story. Subscribe to Tales and Eras for more true stories from history and world events.